When you withdraw from a relationship with a narcissist in a quiet way, without noise, without confrontation, without explanation, what truly happens does not take place on the surface of behavior, but deep within their psychological structure. Many people mistakenly assume that a narcissist's silence is a sign that they have let go, accepted, or stopped caring. But if you look more closely, you will see that this silence is a forced state rather than a choice. They are not silent because they are at peace, but because they no longer have any other way to keep their internal system from collapsing further. In ordinary psychological life, shame is a regulating emotion. It appears when a person recognizes a mismatch between behavior and values, opening the possibility for learning, correction, and growth. But within a narcissistic structure, shame does not operate this way. It does not sit at the surface of consciousness to be reflected upon. It lies at the deepest layer of the ego, where the entire sense of who I am is tightly bound to image, control, and external reflection. As a result, when shame emerges, it does not arrive as a message, but as an existential threat. To understand this, we need to return to how the narcissistic structure is formed. Most narcissists do not develop a stable self from within. Instead, they construct their ego by borrowing from the reactions of others. They learn to exist through being admired, feared, needed, or reacted to. In this structure, a relationship is not a meeting between two subjects, but a regulatory system. The other person absorbs emotions, serves as a mirror, and keeps intact the image the narcissist needs to believe is real. As long as you are there, even in pain, conflict, or explanation, the system continues to function. Conflict itself can even help them feel real because it still generates reactions. But when you withdraw with sovereign silence without needing to win, to be right, or to be understood, you inadvertently do the most dangerous thing to this structure. You cut off the regulatory supply. At that point, shame does not arise because of a specific behavior, but because the entire structure loses its foundation. What makes this state so unbearable for the narcissist is that they lack the inner capacity to contain shame. They cannot sit with emptiness. They cannot look directly at the contradiction between the image they perform and their internal reality. Therefore, shame is not recognized as "I am ashamed," but is experienced as a vague discomfort, a dull pressure, an anxiety that cannot be named. Their instinctive response is to avoid whatever triggers that state, in this case, you. Each time they face you after you have truly withdrawn, they no longer feel the old power. There is no ability to pull you into arguments, no sense of being central, no role to occupy. In that moment, shame rises not as a thought, but as a feeling of being exposed. You do not need to say anything or point out their faults. Your calm presence alone is enough to make a truth visible that they cannot tolerate, that they no longer control the narrative, and that the self they cling to cannot stand on its own. This is why shame within a narcissistic structure never leads to healthy change. Instead, it leads to increasingly elaborate defense strategies. Direct avoidance, disappearance, coldness, distant smear campaigns, or the construction of a new version of the story in which you are diminished so they can continue believing in their old image. All of these strategies share the same purpose, not to deal with you, but to avoid being alone with themselves. Here a deep paradox appears. The more they avoid you, the more shame accumulates. Avoidance does not resolve the inner contradiction, it only postpones it. Each time they choose not to look at you, not to speak to you, not to acknowledge that the relationship ever existed, they widen the gap between the persona and reality. That gap is precisely where shame resides, and because it is never named or integrated, it becomes a prolonged punishment, quiet, undramatic, but persistent and eroding. It is important to understand that this punishment does not come from you. You do not make them feel shame. You do not punish them with silence. You simply stop participating in the system that protected them from feeling shame. When that system stops functioning, shame, which was always present at a deeper level, is allowed to surface. This is a crucial difference between causing and no longer preventing. On your side, if you do not understand this mechanism, you can easily fall into two psychological traps. The first is self-blame, believing that you did something that made them pull away. The second is reversed hope, believing that if you explain more or soften yourself, they will come back and face things. Both pull you back into the old role, the role that allows their structure to keep operating. But when you understand that their avoidance is the inevitable result of existential shame, you begin to see more clearly. It is not that you lost them. It is that they lost the capacity to face someone who no longer exists within their orbit of control. At a deeper level, this is where power shifts. Not power in the sense of manipulation, but existential power. You are no longer the condition that allows another person to exist within an illusion about themselves. You are no longer a compulsory mirror, and that, without any intention on your part, is what makes you unbearable to the narcissistic structure. Not because you attack them, but because you no longer hold them away from their own internal truth. The next part of this video will go deeper into a key question. Why shame, instead of leading to change or awakening in the narcissist, so often leads to rigidity, obsession, or the escalation of distant manipulation, and why understanding this correctly is a crucial step in ensuring you are not pulled back into the old cycle. Part 1. Why shame does not awaken, but hardens the narcissistic structure. When shame arises within a healthy psychological structure, it usually opens the capacity for self-observation, responsibility, and change. But for a narcissist, shame never follows that path. This is not because they are bad or stubborn in a conventional moral sense, but because their entire inner architecture is built to never have to pass through this territory. Shame, in this case, is not a corrective signal, but a threat to the very foundation. And when a system perceives a threat to its survival, its reflex is not learning, but hardening. Hardening here does not mean calmness or stability. It is a state of psychological contraction. Reduced contact, reduced confrontation, reduced emotional access, and intensified defenses. This is why, after you withdraw, many narcissists do not awaken, but instead become colder, more closed off, or shift toward indirect manipulation. Shame makes it impossible for them to stay with themselves. Yet it also prevents them from facing you in any genuine way. The result is a suspended state in which they must both avoid you and simultaneously try to neutralize the emptiness that is eroding them from within. In this state, three responses commonly appear, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is the rigidification of the persona. They may appear unusually fine, displaying success, emphasizing busyness, presenting emotional indifference, or constructing a new, more polished image. This is not recovery, but a temporary patch on a mask, while the internal structure has already cracked. The shinier the image, the deeper the shame beneath it, because the gap between what is performed and what actually is continues to widen. The second response is silent obsession. When direct access to provoke reactions is no longer available, many narcissists turn to distant monitoring, checking social media, gathering information indirectly, holding you in mind as an unresolved point. What they are obsessed with, however, is not you as a person, but the state you represent, the fact that you exist without needing them. Each time they see you moving on, remaining calm, not collapsing, shame is reactivated, and the cycle of obsession and avoidance continues. The third response is the escalation of indirect manipulation. When shame cannot be processed internally, it seeks an outlet, and the most familiar outlet is projection. This may appear as smear campaigns, rewriting the story, casting themselves as the victim, or constructing a narrative in which you are blamed. The goal is not to defeat you, but to push shame outward so they can continue living without having to face it. This is why, over time, the stories they tell drift further from reality, become less coherent, yet require more desperately to be believed. The key point to understand is this: none of these responses are aimed at healing. They are aimed only at reducing pressure. And because shame is not integrated, that pressure does not disappear, it accumulates. The narcissistic structure, therefore, does not collapse immediately, but becomes both rigid and fragile at the same time. Rigid in its defenses, fragile in its foundation. A light touch from reality, a chance encounter, news about you, a small failure can trigger an outsized reaction. Here, your role becomes critically important, not to do anything, but to stop doing what you used to do. Each time you explain, justify, or try to create a peaceful ending, you inadvertently help them avoid shame for another cycle. Each time you return to debate, you provide a reflective surface that allows the old structure to stand temporarily. And each time you try to prove you are right, you keep them at the center of the story. None of this helps them change, and none of it helps you become free. By contrast, when you maintain consistent withdrawal without resentment, without the need to be understood, you do something very difficult but very precise. You allow shame to do its work, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of the removal of a protective system. You do not push them into shame, you stop pulling them out of it. This distinction may sound subtle, but psychologically, it is decisive. From a deeper perspective, this is where your growth and their stagnation diverge. You learn to tolerate incompletion, lack of recognition, the absence of external closure. You build internal closure by facing reality directly, that some structures cannot be engaged through reason or goodwill. Meanwhile, they continue to cycle through avoidance strategies because they lack the inner tools to move through shame. This leads to an important conclusion that is often misunderstood. Shame does not change the narcissist, but it makes it impossible for them to return to their old position with you. They may approach others, construct new stories, create new cycles, but with you, the person who withdrew correctly, they lose their anchor. You become an unfillable void, not because you are more special, but because you no longer play by the old rules. And within narcissistic psychology, an uncontrollable void is more terrifying than an enemy. Part 2. When you are no longer relevant. The true endpoint of narcissistic power. After shame has been activated and the narcissistic structure has hardened in defense, a quiet yet decisive movement begins to take place on your side. This is not a moment of victory, nor the feeling of "I've overcome it," but a very subtle shift in your inner life. You no longer place them at the center of your psychological frame of reference. This may sound simple, but structurally, it is the very thing a narcissist fears most. Not being hated, not being abandoned, but becoming irrelevant. Throughout the relationship, whether in love or in pain, you and they existed within the same field of meaning. They reacted, you reacted back. They hurt you, you tried to understand. They manipulated, you tried to fix things. That entire chain kept them at the center of your psychological life, and that central position was the true source of their power. But when you withdraw long enough, deeply enough, and do not return to the old role, something fundamentally different happens. You no longer face them, not because you are avoiding them, but because they are no longer an internal point of reference. This is where many people confuse silence with detachment. Silence can still be an action charged with emotion. Detachment is different. It no longer needs to send a message, no longer seeks to be understood, no longer asks why. And when this happens, The psychological bond, the foundation of all manipulation, dissolves on its own. No cutting off is required. No declaration is needed. It dissolves because it is no longer being fed. For the narcissist, this is an irreparable state. Every strategy they have ever used is built on the assumption that you still exist within the field of reaction. When you no longer react, they may attempt escalation, sudden appearances, ambiguous signals, narratives constructed from a distance. But if these moves no longer reach you, their power does not merely weaken, it loses its foundation. Not because you are stronger than they are, but because the game no longer has a player. What must be emphasized is that this irrelevance is not coldness or emotional shutdown. It is the result of having completed your part. You have moved through the pain, faced reality directly, and accepted that some structures cannot be saved, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be given a clean ending. And when you accept this at a deep level, you no longer need them to change in order for you to be at peace. You are at peace because you have returned to yourself. At the Jungian level, this is the moment when your ego stops being pulled into projection. You no longer carry their shadow for them. You are no longer the place where they dump what they refuse to see. And when there is no longer a place for projection, they must hold everything within themselves. That is why shame does not fade with time, but becomes a baseline state, quiet, undramatic, yet persistent. Meanwhile, on your side, a sense of stability begins to appear, not because everything has been explained, but because you no longer need explanations. Many people wait for closure as an event, a conversation, an apology, an acknowledgement. But with a narcissistic structure, external closure rarely exists. The only closure available is internal, the moment you understand that their silence, avoidance, and distortion say nothing about your worth, but speak very clearly about their limitations. When you understand this, not only intellectually, but through lived experience, you step out of the cycle. At this point, a quiet reversal occurs. While they become increasingly trapped in old defensive strategies, you begin to reallocate your energy. The energy once spent analyzing them, understanding them, waiting for them, now returns to your own life. Not as busyness to forget, but as deeper presence with reality. You choose relationships with genuine dialogue. You choose spaces that do not require defense. You choose clarity over intensity. This is where many people realize that what they once called passion was actually instability, and what they once feared as ordinary turns out to be safety. For the narcissist, this shift is intolerable. Not because they lost you, but because they lost their role in your psychological life. And once that role is gone, there is no way to restore their former power. They may tell another story, find another person, create another cycle, but with you, a door has closed without needing a lock. Not through willpower, but through irrelevance. The true endpoint of narcissistic power is not confrontation, nor is it their realization. It lies in the moment you are no longer a condition for that structure to exist. And this only happens when you accept a difficult truth. Some relationships do not end through mutual understanding, but through unequal maturation. You move forward. They remain with their structure. From here on, the question is no longer, what are they thinking, or do they regret it? But how am I living when I am no longer being pulled in? And when you sit with that question long enough, honestly enough, you will realize this. The freedom you gain does not come from their silence, but from the fact that you no longer need them to say anything at all. Part 3. The quiet reversal. When you no longer have a function, but become a threshold of awakening. After you are no longer relevant, a phenomenon that is difficult to describe in ordinary language begins to take shape in the narcissist's psychological life. This is not a phase in which they return, nor a phase in which they realize something, but a prolonged suspended state in which they can neither move toward you nor completely erase you from their inner world. The reason lies here. You are no longer a participant in their system, yet you become a psychological marker that their structure cannot pass. When you were still in the old role, you had a function. That function might have been the one who endured, the one who explained, the one who rescued, the one who reacted, or the one who gave their story meaning. But when you withdraw in the right way, you lose your function within their system, and it is precisely this uselessness that turns you into a threshold. A threshold they cannot cross, because crossing it would require changing their internal structure, something they do not have the capacity to do. Here a deep paradox emerges. They no longer need you to run their daily life, yet they cannot integrate the fact that you have exited the old role. You are no longer an object to manipulate, but you become a symbol of an irreparable failure, not a failure of the relationship, but a failure to maintain the illusion that they can control every important connection. And because that illusion once served as a pillar of the ego, your existence in their memory is no longer personal in nature, but structural. This is why many narcissists do not hoover directly, do not confront, yet also do not fully sever. They hold you in an ambiguous place in their mind, like an unresolved point, not to return to you, but to avoid having to admit that there are limits they cannot cross. You become a form of negative proof. You do not need to appear to be present. You do not need to speak to exert pressure. And that pressure does not come from love or longing, but from the fact that their structure cannot close itself. What matters is this. At this stage, you do not need to do anything more. Any attempt to end things clearly, say it all, or put a final period risks pulling you back into the old role. For a narcissistic structure, every dialogue is an opportunity to restore function. By contrast, your consistent absence, without anger, without expectation, keeps you in the correct position. No longer a participant, but not an enemy either. On your side, this is the most easily misunderstood phase. Outwardly, nothing dramatic may seem to happen. There is no visible collapse on their part, no moment in which justice is served. Yet inside you, a restructuring is taking place. You begin to realize that many things you once believed to be deep emotion were in fact role-based attachment. When the role disappears, emotion changes form, not because you have grown numb, but because you are no longer being pulled into artificial intensity. At a deeper level, you are crossing another threshold, the threshold of no longer equating your worth with being needed by someone else. This is a crucial step in psychological maturation. You no longer measure yourself by whether the other person returns, regrets, or changes. You begin to measure yourself by your level of inner peace, by your ability to be alone without contracting, and by your choice of relationships that do not require endurance in order to exist. Meanwhile, the narcissist remains stuck before their own threshold. They may continue their surface life, but they cannot fully erase your trace from their internal system, because you represent the moment when their power failed without a battle. No confrontation, no drama, only withdrawal. And that withdrawal exposes a truth they cannot rewrite in a way that serves the ego. Most of what they do afterward, whether prolonged silence, constructing another narrative, or seeking a new source of supply, is an attempt to avoid returning to this threshold. But avoidance is not the same as crossing. And because they cannot cross it, the threshold continues to exist as an internal limit. You do not need their acknowledgement. You do not need them to name it. Their inability to step beyond it already says everything. On your side, this is where a subtle yet enduring transformation takes shape. You are no longer compelled to understand them, save them, or prove anything. You understand that some structures cannot be healed from the outside, and that your task is not to stay and sacrifice, but to leave and mature. When you understand this, at the level of lived experience, not merely as an idea, the relationship truly ends, not through words, but through a complete reorientation of your inner life. Part 4. Silence is not a strategy, but a final moral stance. At this stage, the most important thing to clarify is that your silence and withdrawal no longer belong to the realm of psychological tactics or emotional self-protection. They have become a stance, not a stance against them, but a stance in favor of truth. And precisely for that reason, it carries a moral dimension that the narcissist cannot face. Throughout the relationship, you were pulled into a world where truth was always negotiable, emotions were distorted, and responsibility was reversed. Everything could be re-explained if doing so helped them preserve their image and control. When you argued, you participated in the game. When you justified yourself, you accepted the rules of that game. But when you withdrew without needing to win, to be right, or to be recognized, you did something they cannot process. You refused to participate in their distorted reality. This is where your silence is fundamentally different from theirs. Their silence is avoidance. Your silence is choice. They are silent to avoid facing shame. You are silent because there is no longer any reason to speak in a space where truth does not exist. These two silences may look the same on the surface, but at a deeper level, they stand at opposite moral poles. The narcissist cannot tolerate this because their entire power is built on the ability to distort reality without being challenged. When you withdraw, you do not challenge them with words, but you challenge them through non-participation. And that non-participation exposes a deeply uncomfortable truth. Their power exists only when someone agrees to live inside the world they construct. When you are no longer there, that world no longer has enough participants to sustain the illusion of reality. At a deeper level, this is the moment when morality is re-established. Not morality in the sense of judging who is right or wrong, but in the most fundamental sense, who takes responsibility for their own inner life. You choose to take responsibility for your emotions, your boundaries, and your growth. They refuse to take responsibility for their shame, their emptiness, and their internal distortion. From that moment on, the two paths fully diverge. This explains why many narcissists never truly learn the lesson, yet also cannot return to things as they were. Not because they have understood, but because your presence in a new state establishes a standard they can neither reach nor destroy. You no longer react in the old way, yet you do not become an enemy. You exist as proof that it is possible to live without manipulation, without drama, without distorting truth, and for a structure that survives on distortion, that is unbearable. On your side, Part 4 is often where the final layer of pain dissolves, not because it is soothed, but because it is correctly understood. You no longer ask, "Why did they do this to me?" Instead, you clearly see how the entire system functioned and the role you were placed into. This clarity is not emotionally intense, but it is deeply liberating. It restores your ability to stand upright in reality without sacrificing yourself to preserve a connection. It is also here that you realize leaving was not a failure of love, but the completion of a developmental cycle. Some relationships exist not to last, but to force growth. And when you grow, that relationship no longer has a place. Not because someone is evil, but because the old structure no longer fits the person you are becoming. For the narcissist, this leaves an unavoidable consequence. They must live with a truth that cannot be fixed through manipulation. The truth that someone has left their orbit without collapsing. The truth that their power has limits. And the truth that shame cannot be healed without inner responsibility. They may continue to avoid, continue telling different stories, continue constructing new personas, but somewhere within their psychological system, the standard you unintentionally set remains as a crack that does not close. And for that reason, your silence is not escape. It is a refusal of complicity, not passivity, but a clear moral act. I will no longer participate in what harms truth. From this point on, what happens to them no longer concerns you, and what happens to you no longer requires them. Two parallel paths that do not intersect, and it is precisely this non-intersection that marks the true ending. Part 5. The punishment of the narcissist. Not karma in a religious sense, but an inner fracture. The punishment of the narcissist does not come from any metaphysical force, nor does it operate according to the simplistic moral logic of you reap what you sow. There is no invisible hand delivering retribution, no moment of judgment, no sentence being pronounced. What happens is far deeper and far more severe, an inner fracture for which they have no language to name, no structure to repair, and no path through. This is not karma in a religious sense, but an irreversible psychological consequence that occurs when a structure sustained by reflection loses its foundation. The narcissist exists through the continuity of image. They need a sense of consistency. Today I am this person, tomorrow I am still that person, and the world around me confirms it. When you withdraw, that continuity is broken not through conflict, but through absence. And absence is the most dangerous thing for a structure without a core. From this point on, their inner world no longer functions as a coherent flow, but as fragments. Emotions that no longer connect to meaning, behavior that no longer connects to responsibility, memories that no longer connect to identity. This fracture is not loud. It does not erupt as rage, nor collapse into an easily recognizable depression. It unfolds quietly in everyday life, a baseline anxiety that never disappears, the constant need to stay busy, to be seen, to continually reassert oneself through a new image. Yet, no matter how many times the image changes, the sense of inner continuity does not return. They live, but they are not truly in their own life. This is the real punishment. Not losing you, not being abandoned, but losing the capacity to live within a continuous self. When the inner world is fractured, everything becomes short-term. Short-term emotions, short-term relationships, short-term pleasure. There is no depth, because depth requires the ability to remain with oneself. There is no peace, because peace requires reconciliation between the inner and the outer worlds. And at this point, the narcissist no longer has the tools to reconcile them. What makes this punishment unavoidable is that it does not depend on circumstances. Whether they become more successful, more admired, or find a new source of supply, the fracture remains. Because it does not reside in a specific relationship, but in the operating structure of the ego itself. Each time they must avoid someone who sees through them, each time they must rewrite the story to protect themselves, each time they cannot face a real memory, the fracture is reinforced. It does not stab sharply, but it endures. Here lies a difficult truth to accept. Not everyone is punished in ways that outsiders can see, but there are punishments that only the person inside can feel, and no one else can bear in their place. Inner fracture does not stop them from living, but it renders life hollow, lacking depth, lacking the ability to rest within oneself. It is a state without climax, yet also without exit. For you, understanding this is the final step in leaving behind the logic of emotional justice. You no longer need to wait for them to receive consequences. You do not need to see them collapse to feel that things are fair. You see that their punishment does not lie in external outcomes, but in their inability to return to a coherent inner life. And once you see this clearly, you are no longer compelled to witness or monitor it. You step out of the role of the injured party seeking justice and into the role of the one who has exited the system. From here on, the fundamental difference between you and them becomes unmistakable. You suffer, but you have the capacity to integrate. You lose, but you have the capacity to restructure. You can sit with emptiness and allow it to become depth. They cannot. And this is neither a curse nor a punishment imposed by the world. It is simply the natural consequence of refusing to face one's own inner truth for too long. The punishment of the narcissist, therefore, does not need to be declared. It operates every day in the way they live, the way they avoid, the way they are unable to be addressed. And when you understand this fully, you no longer wish for anything to happen to them. You simply continue living with an inner life that is more coherent, deeper, and freer, something they themselves, at the deepest level, know they have lost. At this point, the most important thing to close is not the story of the narcissist, but your position within that story. When they no longer dare to face you, when shame becomes a self-operating punishment, when their inner world fractures in silence, these are no longer things you need to observe or explain. Any further effort to understand them only pulls you back into a system you exited at great cost. The deepest truth of this journey is this: you did not leave to make them pay. You left so that you would no longer keep paying for a structure that never intended to grow. And the moment you no longer need to witness the consequences, no longer need to see them collapse, no longer need a just ending, is the moment you truly step out of the narcissistic orbit. The narcissist may continue living, continue performing, continue telling different stories, but there is one thing they cannot do: return to a state of inner coherence as before. You, by contrast, can. You may hurt, you may feel empty, you may feel lost for a time, but you have the capacity to integrate experience into depth. You have the capacity to stay with truth. You have the capacity to live without needing anyone to reflect you in order to feel that you exist. And that is the final boundary between two human beings. Not winning versus losing, not right versus wrong, but the capacity to live with one's own inner world. They do not dare to face you, not because you are special, but because you represent a truth they cannot tolerate, that their power has limits, and that not everyone who leaves will collapse. As you move forward from here, carry only one thing with you. You do not need any further confirmation to close this chapter. The fact that they cannot face you is already the most complete answer. Everything that follows no longer belongs to them, but to the new life you are building. A life that needs no role-playing, no reflection, and no looking back to know that you have gone far enough.